to us by David Conley here from the Commission on Local Government last year when we had a session at this event on Proffer legislation. Last year we had a fair amount of discussion back and forth. We even had a presentation on the pit of death by Andrew
The pit of death.
The pit of death still lives. This graphic is basically showing you where cash proffers are used most heavily, if I'm not incorrect in saying so. This is a data set, again, collected by David Conley's group. And you can see it's mostly along the I-95 corridor that cash proffers are used for residential purposes. But they're used heavily and extensively, which means that they're going to have potentially an economic backlash in terms of how development goes forward in these areas. But most jurisdictions that I didn't include here, maybe see the stipple in here in white, those are all jurisdictions that have cash proffers enabled. So there is a potential here that this cash proffer legislation could have much more far-reaching consequences than simply this I-95 corridor where it's heavily used. That being said, we've seen a number of responses by localities to what they feel comfortable doing in light of the Proffer legislation. So have you limited the scope of where you use these proffers to sort of transportation-oriented development? Have you gotten rid of your cash proffering ordinances altogether? Or have you just gone forward assuming that some kind of legal test case will not surface because it's just not advantageous to do so on the industry's part? So let's start, if you don't mind. Let's start with the audience first and get some sense of where you guys are at, and we'll provide commentary going this way instead of the reverse. What are you guys doing out there? How's it going? What has been the response since last year? Yeah.
We don't use cash proffers that much, but we just find it's really hard to talk to developers about anything because you're so worried about how to address impacts. And so we developed a proper policy and a guidance regarding what is rezoning, what are kind of doing education as to why we could get proffers and under what circumstances and why it's legitimate. But it's a 4-page thing to try to address this issue so we don't talk about it. So it's been hard, on something we don't.
So you maintain or you built out your proffer legislation at the local level, but you're scared to use it. You just don't talk about whether you're going to accept or deny based on the language that's provided to you by the applicant.
Well, you can't suggest proffers, then you're going to have to say it's up to you to determine the impacts, and it's up to you to, if you want to mitigate them, and then where to make the decision.
So one response has been that the county or local jurisdiction is putting it back on the applicant to basically pony up the dollars necessary to do the analysis to make that nexus and that reasonableness happen, and then provide that proffer based on that calculation. So putting it back on the applicant. Is that, Andrew, have you seen that as an approach, or is it mostly just the reverse?
Well, that's absolutely an appropriate approach. I mean, we've always at the local government level said that there need to be reasonable application fees to cover the local government costs to evaluate. What this new statute has done is significantly increase the amount of analysis that is needed of a proffer in order for a local government to feel comfortable that it is, quote, reasonable, unquote. Traditionally, proffers have been treated like every other zoning regulation. It's presumed to be correct. The landowner, neighbor, somebody that wishes to challenge the local government regulation has to prove that there is no reasonable basis for it. Has to prove that there are no reasonable ways to evaluate that. This statute completely upended that analysis. Now, proffers, if they are off-site or cash, as defined, they're presumed to be unreasonable, and local government has to justify them under a very, very rigorous standard. Now, some local governments have been more comfortable doing that analysis and simply saying, we're going to do that analysis, we're going to have the applicant pay for it, like you're describing. And that's certainly one approach to take. Other local governments have said, look, that is actually, in the end, given the fact that it's presumed unreasonable and we have to justify it, why are we really playing that game? In the end, there are, of course, going to be costs in those cash or off-site proffer situations that are simply not going to be compensated by the applicant. When somebody pops up and alleges that it's unreasonable, what about legal costs? What happens when there is in fact a finding that it's unreasonable? I've told my clients that if you can avoid it, don't enter the pit of death, because if you do enter the pit of death, then you really are tiptoeing around a deep hole, and just a matter of time before you fall in or somebody pushes you. Let me describe for the room what I mean by pit of death, since some of you may not have been here last year when I described that. It actually came from a flow chart that I received from a very good land use attorney in Northern Virginia. His name is Andrew Painter. And he, like other local government law attorneys, was trying to struggle with how the statute applied and under what circumstances would it apply, and basically how it went through the process. He developed a very helpful schematic where on the left-hand side of that schematic, there are certain exceptions, mainly Northern Virginia metro-based kinds of special small area plan exceptions. Once you got down to the lower part of the schematic, it's either a cash off-site proffer or it's not. If it is a on-site proffer, it still has to be reasonable and related to the impact and things like that. But if it is in fact cash or off-site, you enter what I call the pit of death. And at that point in time, there's about, I think, 6 or 7 ways where you can be deemed unreasonable. And each one of those 6 or 7 things are things that normally local governments do fairly frequently anyway, in other kinds of zoning. And it's very difficult not to stay out of the pit. And so that's why many local governments, I believe, are simply not playing the game. They're revoking their cash proffer policies, they're amending their ordinances, even if authorized to do cash proffers, to simply say, we no longer do cash proffers. Certainly proffers are not mandatory. There's no statute that says you have to have them. It's a permissive statute. Some local governments have simply said we're not going to play that game anymore, and instead we're going to use the general proffer statute, which only allows really on-site proffers and a much more restricted review. There's probably as many as a dozen different ways to whack at this problem, but in my opinion, it's very, very hard to stay out of the pit, and so I've been advising my clients simply not to play near the edge of the pit. But one more thing. And one of the issues also, in addition to the reasonable proffer being presumed not to be reasonable, is it changes the zoning analysis and review from a legal perspective. Zoning is almost always reviewed on an objective standard, and that is, did the Board of Supervisors or City Council act reasonably here? They're presumed to have done so, and someone which is to challenge that action has to actually meet a fairly high standard. With the role reversed, and it is unreasonable, and the local government has to approve it, and because there are certain things where there has been sort of a, quote, request or demand for that particular unreasonable proffer, it becomes not an objective standard in that case, but did an individual who is representing and authorized by the local government somehow, did they actually do that act? If they did that act, then it fails. It's an unreasonable proffer. It gets to be very, very difficult to defend. And so what I tell my clients on that issue is simply don't talk to applicants. Do not talk to them about what proffers could be helpful. Don't even talk to them about the impacts. Some of my colleagues have said, well, I'm not telling them what a proffer has to be, I'm just telling them what the impacts are. I've defended cases in the very similar CUP, unconstitutional condition statute, and there's a very gray, very small, thin line between suggestions of impacts that are unaddressed and a request or demand for a proffer to address that impact. And certainly a good plaintiff's lawyer will very quickly say, that's exactly what you said. That's exactly what you meant. You wanted me to proffer that. That's unreasonable. Therefore, your act, whether it's you, the zoning administrator, you, the elected official, you, the planning commission member, you have actually caused your local government liability, legal expenses, and exposure. And that's why I say, let's just not go play near to the death. Obviously, there are a lot of local government attorneys who have found ways to address those issues, and local government planners who are finding ways to address those concerns. My view is, just throwing it back to my sort of policy advocates here who are on the panel, I just don't see the statute works very well. And I think it doesn't work for applicants, it doesn't work for landowners, it doesn't work for certainty of the process, which is, in the end, what I hear applicants, developers, attorneys tell me they want. That being the case, it's just a bad bill. And the sooner this statute does not work for applicants, developers, builders, landowners, neighbors, and communities, the sooner the General Assembly will get the message. Eldon earlier talked about Charlie Brown's adults there going wah, wah, wah. It's local government saying the statute is bad, it doesn't work, it will literally sound like that to the General Assembly. When it's your local building association, your local chamber of commerce, and the home builders of Virginia, then it will sound a lot different.
With that being said, have any jurisdictions in here seen either a slowdown in development or some kind of a knot on the types of development that are happening back home as a result of changes you've made to your cash profit process? You guys have? Where are you at? What is new residential taking?
We haven't seen new residential rezoning because we just don't have it in the processes. It's like Andrew was saying. I haven't talked to him yet, and our county attorneys, I think he had said they were going to try to look at the impact fees somehow, maybe, to address something like this, so I don't know.
Okay. So, a dramatic slowdown,
Yeah.
no applicants.
It's rezonings of old existing zonings that are trying to adjust those.
Okay. You guys want it?
In Spotsylvania, we didn't see any residential rezonings for a good year. Nobody wanted to be the first applicant, basically. So now we have 3, and we're at the point where we're analyzing the progress of the first one. The applicant was willing to proffer about $9,000 a unit. Our analysis came back about $125 a unit. So now the applicant's completely freaked out.
Wow.
He's willing to proffer that. That's where we are.
Okay. That's the absence of negotiation happening. Other jurisdictions or other fallout that you guys want to talk about in terms of, and maybe it's not just a slowdown in residential building, but maybe something else that's come out of this. Is something working better as a result of this legislation that we didn't see? Maybe an unintended positive outcome from this?
I think so. But maybe I'm the only one. I don't like the bill, but I think the unintended consequence is, for me, I've worked in various states, and impact fees are more predictable and are better positioned. They're evaluated every year, they're redone, and so I feel a little bit kind of like I do about the broadband wireless thing. It's kind of, well, we want this, but we also don't want to give any. And so you can see the developers in the language that was written really asking for that impact fee, that level of service establishment, but then still not quite ready to use the word. And so I think that at a minimum, for planners and for local governments, we're taking a look at our level of service. We're saying, where do we want to go? What are we currently offering now? What direction are we going? And so I think while the bill kind of penalizes you for having built-in capacity, it's still a chance to say, okay, let's take a closer look at how we're paying for growth and what our level of service is, and can we maintain that? So I think the conversation is at least good, and hearing what was an unintended consequence, but all in all, I still think it's a bad bill.
Over the years, I've worked in a lot of local governments that during the boom times were concerned with what we call at the time growth management. We were concerned about subdivisions were sprawling into rural areas, and we wanted to sort of adopt various mechanisms to stop that. This statute has effectively stopped applications for residential rezonings in part because local governments are afraid of it. People don't want to be the test case. You know, just to use your example, they're willing to proffer a bunch of money, and local government cannot legally accept it. But there's still a $125 impact. So if they don't proffer the $125, they can't say to the local government that my development is not, you know, fully mitigating the impacts. On the other hand, if they do, then you enter the pit of death, and where are you at that point in time if somebody complains about it later? And it may not be the current applicants. The current applicants may be well-minded people. The attorney representing them is certainly acting in good faith, and maybe a community member that's trusted. But these things do have a shelf life that runs with the land, and certainly that is a major concern of who comes next.
Can I challenge you on that, whether or not they actually fall into the pit of death? Because the pit of death, as I understand it, requires that the applicant feels aggrieved by the non-acceptance or the acceptance of their application, and therefore files suit. So even though they may meet criteria for being aggrieved, they don't necessarily have to file a suit, and therefore the proffer is going to be accepted. Yes.
Well, it goes to the famous corollary to the Dillon rule, and that is, if no one complains, you have the authority to act. But as an attorney, I certainly do not advise my lawyers to take on, my clients to take on potential liability. You're right, no one has to file a lawsuit, but you know, do you want to risk it? These are attorney's fees as well as compensatory damages that come along with that.
Well, the image that comes to my head is sort of like two gunslingers, right? And do they, whether or not they trust each other to salute, is whether or not there's a fight, right? So there's a reason that why they had 3 applicants come in and now have 3 residential permits going through. Something happened between 0 and 3. And I'm wondering if it's not just 3 gunslingers saying, I'm going to risk it.